They don't tell you this when you're young, but one day you'll find yourself looking around, searching, waiting for someone to come help you, someone to show up when you're breaking, someone to pick you up, to hold your hand, to tell you that everything will be okay. But the longer you live, the more painfully clear it becomes no one is coming. No one is going to save you. No one is going to fight your battles, carry your burdens, or hand you the life you dream of. And the sooner you accept this, the stronger you become. Because life is not a cradle. It's not a shelter from struggle. It's a battlefield. And on that battlefield, no one survives by waiting. Only those who learn to stand on their own 2 feet, bleeding, shaking, but unbent. Only they make it out stronger than they entered. The illusion we've been sold that someone will always be there, that circumstances will eventually turn in our favor, that someone will pull us from the fire is comforting. But comfort is not truth. And the truth is, if you want to make it, you have to stop hoping for help. You have to become your own rescue. That truth hits hard because it strips away the excuses. It removes the escape routes, but it also hands you something far more valuable: power. When you stop expecting someone else to fix it, you finally realize that you're the one holding the hammer. The strongest people in the world, the ones you admire, the ones who seem unbreakable, they weren't arm-handed strength. They were forced to build it alone, without applause, without support, in silence. They had to walk through rejection, through failure, through darkness with no guarantee of light. And they kept walking. So now the question is no longer whether help will come. It won't. The question is, when life takes everything from you, when you're stripped of the crowd, the comfort, the support, what remains? Who are you when there's nothing to lean on? Will you fold or will you rise? Will you collapse under the weight of solitude, or will you use it to forge steel where flesh once trembled? Because that's where it begins, not in strength, but in surrendering the illusion of being saved. You start to see clearly. No one is going to carry you, and that's not tragedy. That's freedom. You begin to carry yourself. You lift your own weight. You look yourself in the mirror and say, I'm all I've got, but I'm enough. That is the birth of real power, not built in applause, but in the silence, when no one sees, when no one claps, when no one comes. And the silence has a way of stretching, of pressing into the corners of your mind and pulling up everything you've buried. Most people never get that far. They panic at the sound of it. They run the moment the crowd fades. They scramble to fill the empty spaces with noise, with people, with anything to distract them from the one person they're not ready to meet, themselves. Because being alone doesn't just mean being without company. It means being without performance, no masks, no pretending, no roles to play. And for many, that's unbearable. Because when the lights go out and the room goes quiet, what's left is the real you. And the real you can't be lied to. But that's exactly why solitude is sacred. Not because it's easy, but because it's honest. Because when you're left alone with nothing but your thoughts, your fears, your raw and unfinished soul, you finally see what you're made of. Not what you show the world, not what they applauded, what's underneath, what's real. And most people will never face that version of themselves. They spend their entire lives surrounded by noise, hiding inside relationships, performing for approval, terrified of being alone, not because they hate silence, but because they hate what it reveals. Yet for those who don't run, for those who stay in the silence and let it burn away the pretense, something powerful begins to take shape. You stop depending. You stop chasing. You stop giving away your power in exchange for company that was never real to begin with. And instead, you build quietly, day by day, in the dark, where no one claps and no one watches. You train your mind. You discipline your emotions. You become someone no one can manipulate because you no longer seek permission. You become someone no one can break because you've already faced yourself and didn't flinch. There is something terrifying about the discipline it takes to keep showing up in the dark when no one is watching, when no one is rewarding your effort, when no one knows how many times you've almost quit. That's where self-leadership is forged, because in solitude there are no reminders. There's no schedule someone else designed. There's no crowd to impress. It's just you and the decision to rise or to rot. And most people, they wait for motivation, for energy, for the perfect moment to feel right. But the strongest don't wait. They act in spite of how they feel. They move forward when nothing inside them wants to. They've trained themselves to choose purpose over emotion. Discipline is the quiet commitment to do what must be done. Not when it's convenient, not when it's easy, but always. It's waking up when your body begs to stay in bed. It's showing up when there's no applause, no reward, no accountability. It's staying consistent in the face of boredom, exhaustion, temptation, and uncertainty. And every single act of discipline, no matter how small, reinforces your identity. I do hard things. I keep promises to myself. I move forward anyway. Over time, that identity becomes a fortress, one that doesn't collapse every time life gets hard because it wasn't built on moods. It was built on mission. But discipline will always drag you into war with your craving for comfort. And comfort is seductive. It whispers that you've done enough, that you've earned a break, that today can be skipped, that life should feel easier than this. And if you believe it, if you give into it, you lose something deeper than a habit. You lose your edge, because comfort doesn't just make you soft, it makes you forget. Forget who you were before the excuses. Forget what you said you wanted. Forget what it feels like to push, to grow, to become. Growth does not live in the comfortable. It never has. It hides in the friction, in the resistance, in the moments when your mind tells you to stop, but your spirit refuses. The body grows stronger through struggle. The mind becomes sharper under pressure. The soul deepens in fire. And that fire isn't there to destroy you. It's there to expose what you're made of. And most people will never step into it. They live lives designed to avoid it. They surround themselves with softness, with routine, with distractions that keep them safe and slow and numb. And then they wonder why they feel empty, why they feel weak, why they never change, because they never let the flame touch them. They never stayed long enough in discomfort to break through. But those who lean in, those who feel the weight, the burn, the stretch, and don't run, they change. Slowly, steadily, permanently. Every painful moment they endure becomes a thread in the fabric of something unshakable. Every time they show up, even when it hurts, they prove they are more than their circumstances, more than their cravings, more than their fear. And fear is exactly what most people run from. Not just fear of failure, but fear of pain, fear of the unknown, fear of discomfort. They spend years building lives designed to avoid it. But pain is not your enemy. pain is your tutor, the one force that strips away the unnecessary and shows you exactly where your weakness lives. And when you stop running from it, when you sit with it, listen to it, learn from it, you begin to see that it wasn't there to punish you. It was there to prepare you. Think about it. Every ounce of strength you carry today, every layer of resilience, every drop of grit came from something that once brought you to your knees. It came from the betrayal that shattered you, the failure that humiliated you, the loss that emptied you. And yet here you are, stronger than the version of yourself that existed before that pain ever came. Because pain, unlike comfort, never lies. It teaches what ease never could. It forces a reckoning of priorities, of character, of truth. But most people spend their lives dodging pain like it's some kind of virus. They avoid confrontation, avoid rejection, avoid sacrifice. They avoid trying because failing might hurt. They avoid speaking because being misunderstood might sting. They avoid beginning because finishing might break them. But the avoidance of pain is not safety, it's surrender. A slow erosion of courage, of growth, of purpose. It's how warriors turn into spectators, how dreamers become drifters, how strength is traded away for comfort and numbness. Because pain doesn't go away when you run from it. It follows quietly, patiently, until one day it finds you weaker than ever. And this time, you don't know how to carry it. But if you've faced it before, if you've trained in the furnace of hardship, if you've learned to look pain in the eye and say, "Show me," then it loses its power to break you. It becomes something else entirely. It becomes your fuel. Every struggle becomes a sharpening stone. Every scar becomes a story not of survival, but of evolution. The people who seem indestructible, they weren't born with that armor. They built it, one wound at a time. They weren't protected from the fire. They walked into it willingly, not because they enjoyed suffering, but because they understood that nothing else could build them faster. And the most extraordinary thing about pain is that it doesn't just build endurance, it builds clarity. It burns away what doesn't matter, what you don't need, the noise, the fake dreams, the shallow distractions. It leaves you standing there with just your will, your conviction, your raw identity. And that's when decisions get real. That's when action becomes clean. That's when your path stops being theoretical and becomes lived. But even then, even with all that fire behind you, there's still a trap that can rob you of everything. And it's a trap that most never even see because it's wrapped in hope. It's the lie of waiting, waiting for a better time, waiting for things to settle, waiting for someone to give permission, waiting for a door to open, a hand to reach out, a sign to arrive. But time is not your savior. Delay is not protection, it's decay. The longer you wait, the weaker you become. Because waiting builds hesitation. Hesitation builds doubt. Doubt builds passivity. And passivity becomes a habit, a life lived one excuse at a time. I'll do it when I'm ready. I'm just not feeling it today. One day, when things are easier. But here's the truth. It never gets easier. It just gets later. And those who keep waiting eventually realize they've waited their life away. Opportunity didn't disappear. They just never stepped forward. Because action is the only answer. Not plans, not affirmations, not daydreams, movement. The smallest step taken today will always beat the biggest intention waiting for tomorrow. But people are addicted to the idea that something, Someone will come and change everything for them. They tell themselves when the timing's right. But timing is made, not found. Strength is earned, not wished for. And the more you move, the more you take ownership, the more you see the truth. No one is coming. No one is going to do the work. No one is going to give you the life you want. And that's not sad. It's liberating. Because it means you don't have to wait anymore. You don't need permission. You don't need validation. You don't need backup. You just need to move. One choice, 1 hour, one representative, one page, and then another and another. Momentum isn't magic, it's muscle. And those who build it brick by brick become unstoppable. Because each act of discipline, each time you move forward without being told, you're building not just your results, you're building your identity. You're becoming the kind of person who doesn't sit still and wish. You become a builder, not a beggar. But builders don't just work in ideal conditions. They know the storms will come. They expect the setbacks. They know the world owes them nothing, and that's why they stay ready. Because life is unpredictable. People leave. Promises break. Support fades. And when it all falls apart, if your strength came from outside sources, you fall with it. And that's exactly where most people collapse. Not because life hit them too hard, but because they never learned to stand alone. They built castles on the shoulders of others. They built confidence on compliments. They built direction on the opinions of friends, family, society. But when those voices go quiet, what's left? When no one calls, when no one claps, when no one checks in, can you still rise? Can you still move? Can you still believe? Because the truth is, even those who love you most can't carry you forever. Not because they're cruel, but because they're fighting their own battles. And at some point, you have to choose whether you will finally become your own foundation. Because the support of others may come and go, but you are the only constant in your story. And when you accept that, you stop expecting safety. You stop leaning on what's temporary. You stop wishing someone would come rescue you from responsibility. And instead, you rise. You become the rescuer, the one who shows up, the one who holds the line. Not because it's easy, but because no one else can walk your path for you. And here's where most people break, not because they're incapable, but because they've built their entire sense of strength on being seen. And when the lights go off, they forget who they are. They think solitude makes them smaller, but solitude doesn't shrink you, it reveals you. It tears away what's performative. It removes what's borrowed. It leaves behind only what is real. And most people can't handle that level of honesty. They'll say they're scared of being alone, but what they're really afraid of is sitting in silence and realizing how much of their identity was shaped by others. How many of their decisions were made for approval? How many of their dreams weren't really theirs? That's what hurts. That's what breaks people. Not the loneliness, the reflection. But the ones who stay, who face the silence without flinching, those are the ones who rise different. Because once you've stood in front of the mirror with no mask, no noise, no audience, and didn't look away, you don't come back the same. You come back clearer, calmer, harder to move, harder to please, harder to shake, because now you know who you are when there's nothing left to hide behind. And when that truth becomes your foundation, everything else becomes optional. You stop chasing people who don't respect your time. You stop begging for acceptance. You stop living to be seen because you've already seen yourself and you didn't crumble. That's when the noise starts to fade. You no longer need the crowd, the opinions, the likes. You don't need someone to tell you that you're doing okay. You just know. Because you've built your self-worth in the dark, and that kind of worth doesn't need permission. It doesn't need applause. It just moves quietly, steadily, like a force of nature. The people who become untouchable aren't the ones who hide from rejection, but the ones who no longer fear it. They're not hardened. They're free. And freedom always looks like power to those still living in chains. Because when your sense of strength comes from within, no loss can break you, no betrayal can define you, no disappointment can stop you. You've already buried weaker versions of yourself to become who you are now. You've already died and rebuilt in silence, without witnesses, without credit. And that kind of transformation, done alone, without shortcuts, without celebration, creates something that can't be faked. Something that doesn't bend when life applies pressure. It creates someone who stands. But standing alone is not just about solitude, it's about responsibility. Because once you realize that no one is coming to save you, that solitude isn't the enemy, that pain is the teacher, that waiting is the trap, you also realize this. If you fall, it's on you to rise. No more blame. No more victimhood. No more, what if they had helped me? It's just you, your choices, your outcomes. And that's where self-discipline steps in, not as a punishment, but as a promise. A promise to yourself that no matter how hard it gets, no matter how tired you are, no matter how far away the reward seems, you will show up. You will take the step. You will carry the weight because you've stopped outsourcing your future to other people's approval and started investing it in your own consistency. The world teaches you to depend, from birth, on parents, on teachers, on systems, on society. And little by little, you're taught that to be alone is to be unsafe, that being alone is to be broken. But the truth is the opposite. Being alone is where you're finally free to be unfiltered, unedited, undistracted, and most people can't handle that freedom. Because with it comes responsibility, with it comes the mirror, with it comes the end of excuses, and maybe that's why so many people stay stuck in the cycle of attachment, because detaching from the world means facing everything you've avoided. It means asking yourself the hard questions. Why do I follow? Why do I settle? Why do I stay where I don't grow? And the answers don't come easy, but when they come, they open doors no one else can open for you. Because no one can free you but you. Because once you taste what it means to stand on your own, you begin to see just how many things you used to rely on were never real to begin with. The relationships that only worked because you were convenient. The support that disappeared the moment you needed it most. The validation that vanished when you stopped performing. You start to see through it all. And that vision, clear, sober, unfiltered, is both painful and liberating. Because you realize that much of what you lost was never truly yours. It was borrowed. It was conditional. It was temporary. And now, finally, what's left is solid. You start to live differently. You don't beg for reassurance. You don't reach for noise to drown your doubts. You don't break when things don't go your way because your foundation is no longer out there. It's in here. You've walked through fire and didn't die. You've stared into the silence and found strength instead of fear. You've suffered and discovered that the pain didn't break you, it revealed you. But strength doesn't end with survival. True strength demands you stay consistent in the dark, that even when no one is watching, even when no one is holding you accountable, you still show up. That's where discipline isn't a tool, it's a lifestyle. And most people never build it. Because they only do hard things when they're being watched. They only stay committed when there's pressure from the outside. But the moment that pressure disappears, so does their effort. And that's the difference. The difference between those who perform and those who endure. Because enduring requires internal pressure. The kind that doesn't need alarms or reminders or deadlines. The kind that says, I show up because I said I would. I don't wait to feel ready. I don't need to be in the mood. I do the work because it's who I am. And when you build that kind of discipline where your standard doesn't bend with your feelings, you become dangerous because most people are emotional creatures. They move when they feel like it. They quit when it hurts. They shrink when it gets quiet. But not you. You move anyway. You keep going. And that's what sets you apart. Because when life no longer has the power to dictate your energy, when circumstances don't control your choices, you've won. Not because you avoided pain, but because you've mastered your response to it. That's what power is. Not domination, not control, but freedom from being ruled by what happens around you. You don't need someone clapping to keep going. You don't need the weather to be perfect. You don't need motivation to show up. You've made a decision, a vow, and vows built in solitude are always stronger than promises made in front of a crowd, because you didn't make them for show. You made them for survival. That kind of self-reliance can't be faked, and it can't be borrowed. It has to be earned alone, which is why so few people ever develop it, because earning it requires sacrifice. It requires struggle. It requires doing what most avoid, but what they avoid, you walk into willingly, repeatedly. Because you understand something most never will. The easy road leads nowhere. The hard road leads to power. And power, real power, never comes cheap. And that's why you see so few people rise. Not because they're not capable, but because they stop. They stop when it gets hard. They stop when it's no longer exciting. They stop when things don't go as planned. The moment resistance shows up, they interpret it as a sign to quit. Maybe it's not meant to be, they whisper to themselves, not realizing that resistance is the test. Resistance is the proof you're on the right path. Because anything worth having will push back. Anything real will demand more than you feel ready to give. And most aren't willing. But those who keep going, those who walk through the fog, the failure, the fatigue, they are the ones who transform. Not because they had fewer problems, but because they refused to let those problems define their limits. They refused to let one bad day turn into a bad life. They got knocked down, sure, but they always got back up. And with each return, they became harder to stop. Each failure, a lesson. Each setback, a sharpening. Each obstacle, another layer of armor. Eventually, they realize that what the world sees as toughness is really just consistency, not dramatic, not glamorous, just relentless. They show up again and again and again, not because they're superhuman, but because they've learned how to stay focused on the mission, not the mood. They've learned that feelings are fleeting, but discipline is a decision, a mindset, a way of life. So when others fold under pressure, they stand. When others slow down, they accelerate. When others second guess, they commit. And not because they're fearless, but because they've made peace with fear. They've looked fear in the eyes so many times that it's lost its grip. It still whispers, but it no longer commands. And in that space, they've found something priceless: control. Not over the world, but over themselves. They've built a mind that doesn't collapse every time the ground shakes. A will that doesn't bend every time life bites back. A fire that doesn't go out when the wind picks up. That's the kind of strength no one can hand you. You have to bleed for it, sweat for it, break and rebuild for it. You have to earn it in the trenches when no one is watching, when the world has counted you out, when even your own mind tells you to quit and you don't. Because that's what it means to be truly strong, not loud, not boastful, but unbreakable, quietly, consistently, fully. And once you've built that kind of strength, there's not a single thing in this world that can stop you unless you let it. But even the strongest will is incomplete without mastery over the inner world. Because it's not just the world outside that tests you, it's the world within. The noise inside your own head. The fear that sneaks in before a leap. The doubt that creeps in after a failure. The anger that rises when you're misunderstood. The sadness that lingers when no one notices how hard you're trying. Most people lose not to the world, but to themselves. Not because life was too heavy, but because they never learned how to carry their own emotions. They react instead of respond. They let their feelings steer the ship. They make permanent decisions based on temporary storms. One bad day and they burn the bridge. One harsh word and they give up the dream. One closed door and they retreat completely. That's how dreams die, not with explosions, but with quiet surrenders to emotion. And it's not that emotion is bad. It's not your enemy. Emotion is fuel. But fuel, if uncontrolled, can burn down everything you've built. The strongest people don't ignore their emotions. They master them. They feel fear, but still move. They feel anger, but stay in control. They feel pain, but keep their head clear. Because power is not found in pretending to be numb. It's found in knowing when to let emotion speak and when to let discipline lead. That balance of heart and head, of fire and stillness, is what makes someone truly unshakable. Because no storm outside can match the chaos of a storm within. And when you've learned to calm that storm, there is nothing left to fear. Emotional control is not about suppression, it's about space. The space between impulse and action. The space between fear and movement, the space between offense and reaction. That space is where strength lives, where wisdom lives, where freedom lives, and most people have no space. They live at the mercy of their feelings. But when you build that space, you begin to live on your own terms. You stop being a slave to the moment. You stop being tossed around by moods. You start choosing every single time what matters most over what feels easiest. And the people who do that day after day become immovable. They don't just survive life, they shape it. They walk through chaos with clarity. They speak when it matters and stay silent when it's wise. They build things that last because they don't keep tearing them down in emotional storms. That kind of person is rare because it takes more than motivation, more than inspiration. It takes work, deep inner work. And most people are too busy reacting to ever begin that process. But not you. You're doing the work. You're learning to pause, to breathe, to notice when your old patterns want to take over, and to choose differently. That choice, repeated again and again, becomes identity. And identity becomes destiny, because once you've mastered yourself, there's nothing left to master. The world is still wild, the storms still come, but you've built something within that doesn't shake anymore.